And then we're also going to talk about what's happening in the central canal. So in order for the bone cells to get the nutrition, you need to have lots of blood vessels in there, and you also have nerves in there. So you have blood flow and nervous tissue in there. And if you look at this picture on the top, you have sort of a bigger and bigger diagram right here. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner, this is a drawing of a single osteon, and then on the left-hand side is a microscopic image of a single osteon. So at the center of this right here is called the central canal. So here is the central canal. This central canal is covered by osteon, by endosteum. Then there's additional layers right here, and those layers are called lamellae. And if they're not overlapping, they're called concentric lamellae. So there's concentric lamellae in an individual osteon. So there's 1, 2, 3 concentric lamellae. There's also spaces between those lamellae, and those spaces are lacunae, and those have osteocytes. And then the osteocytes then are talking to each other. So this one is talking to this one by this little canal, and that little canal is called a canaliculi. So if we're looking at from this perspective right here, so this is the proximal epiphysis of the femur. We have the spongy bone right here, and then on the medial surface of the spongy bone, and that's distal from it, we have compact bone. So if we then look here, now this is the superficial portion of the compact bone, so that in this area right here, it's called the medullary cavity. The medullary cavity itself is lined by the endosteum. The superficial portion of the bone is lined by the periosteum. So this portion right here is lined by the periosteum. This is lined by the endosteum. And that's what we're looking at right here. This is the periosteum. And these are individual osteons. And then when we get deep to the, here, right, or to the center of this hole right here, this is the medullary cavity. And if you notice right adjacent to the medullary cavity, this area right there looks very familiar, very similar to the spongy bone.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you. That's
So this is spongy bone that's directly adjacent to the medullary cavity. And I told you that spongy bone was on the epiphyses, and that's not really always true. It's also adjacent to the medullary cavity. Now, what bone cell is going to be responsible for making the medullary cavity? Osteoclast. Right. What bone cell is going to be responsible for making the spaces here for these trabeculae, the osteoclasts? What bone cell is going to be responsible for making new trabeculae, osteoblasts? What cells are going to be responsible for maintaining those trabeculae, osteocytes? Okay. Those last 5 minutes or so, if I have used a lot of terms, right? If those terms are familiar to you, that's great. If they're not familiar to you, then what you need to do is go back to these slides and write down those terms over and over and over again. This picture right here is really simple to replicate. Here is a larger picture. If you look at on the right-hand side, there's more, a slightly bigger vocabulary list right here. So we have, first of all, this entire structure right here is called the osteon. That center hole right there is called the central canal. And if you look on the right-hand side, this portion of the slide right here, that central canal is going parallel to the axis of the bone, so that it will be running parallel to the length of the femur, let's say. But then there are these holes that are perforating or run perpendicular. So this one is a perpendicular hole right here. There are arteries and veins. I'm not worried about this is a big artery and vein. This is a smaller artery and vein. I don't care if you know the difference between the names. But this is an artery and vein that's going perpendicular to the length of the bone. This is parallel to the length of the bone. If it's parallel, it's a central canal. If it's perpendicular, then it's called a perforated canal. So perpendicular, again, what's the job there? You need to get food and oxygen, carbohydrates, and things like that into these blood cells. You need to get a lot of blood flow in there. What else is happening in here? You're also making blood cells. If you're making blood cells, you need to get those new blood cells out. of the bone, right? How do you get that? Through these blood vessels. So you need to get stuff in and get stuff out. In addition, here, if you look on the left-hand side where my pointer is, all of this area right here will be layered by the endosteum. Superficially, this area right here will be layered by the periosteum. We mentioned a minute ago, there's lamellae. The concentric lamellae are the ones that don't overlap, so that if you're drawing the target picture, then those don't overlap. But if they overlap, or if they, you see there's concentric and circumferential. So what the hell is that? So if you look superficially right near the periosteum, there's also a layer of these compact bone, these lamellae, that surround the entire bone. So if they surround the entire bone, those are called circumferential. So where my pointer is right there are circumferential lamellae, and these are concentric lamellae. The shape basically is the difference. Everything else is the same. All the different terms here. So these canals right here, there's endosteum and periosteum, there's canaliculi, there's lacunae, there's lamellae, and there's then these canals too, okay? So this central canal is going to be blood vessel filled. That central canal will be communicating with the perforating canal and sending signals or sending information to the lacunae, which is where the osteocytes reside. How does it get to the lacunae? It goes through the canaliculi. And which is it going to hit first? It's going to hit it being the blood. Blood is going to hit the circumferential lamellae first, and then it's going to go to the concentric lamellae. Why is that? Circumferential lamellae are superficial, concentric lamellae are deep. There's also these other types of lamellae, and I'm not going to ask you about that. So there's two different types of canals. There's perforating, perpendicular, and the central canals. And I don't think there's really a lot of need to talk about that. All right. So that previous 10 or so minutes, a lot of vocabulary, right? If you can't talk about the vocabulary like I can, and that's understandable, but you need to really up your game like that. I don't think Mrs. Beligen spends a lot of time on that, or Ms. Minardi, because I think they spend time doing other stuff, right? So that is a big part of the quiz on Tuesday or Monday, I don't know. Whenever the hell we have the quiz. So this is a significant chunk of that material. So now let's go on to vocabulary associated with gross anatomy, or bones, big bones. So bone markings and surface features here. If you look on the left-hand side, you have an anterior view of the skull. On the right-hand side, there's a sagittal section of the skull right here. So now, my pointer, where is my pointer? What side of the skull is my pointer on? So it's the right side of the skull, correct? There shouldn't be any question about that. Now in terms of the cells, or the projections and openings right here, we talked about openings already. These projections or openings right here, there's processes in ramus or rami. So there's a particular ramus that, there's 3 rami that are in the part of the os coxa. That there's the superior and inferior ramus of the pubis, there's a ramus of the ischium. And those together form an entire whole, and that whole is called a foramen. I haven't mentioned this space right here called a sinus. If any of you have allergies, I have allergies. Periodically, I'm just like, I got a headache, and it just doesn't feel good. Why is these spaces filled with material? There's sort of swelling in there, and that's what causes the pain. That sinus is, there's 2 sinuses you have to know. There's more than that, but there's one called the frontal sinus, and typically if you have a headache right here, that's your frontal sinus, the swelling in there. The bone doesn't flex very well, right? The bone is rigid. So what happens is the pressure builds up and then you feel like crap. And then there's the second sinus is right here. What bone is that purple bone? Anyone know?
Is that the ethmoid?
Close. It's not the ethmoid.
Lacrimal?
Not the lacrimal. Lacrimal will be sphenoid bone. This is centrally located right here, the sphenoid bone. So if you look on the left-hand side, here is the sphenoid sinus, there's the frontal sinus, and there's all the maxillary sinuses. You don't need to know that. I talked about foramens and fissures here, a meatus and a canal. A meatus and a canal are the same thing. For the moment. The difference between a foramen or a foramina and a fissure is a rounded hole is a foramen or a foramina, and a fissure is a slit or a furrow. If you look on the left-hand side right here, we have a picture of the left os coxae. The os coxae, when we do the next mini practical, not this week, but next, here I'm going to say to you that I want you to know that this is the ilium, where my pointer is. Down here is the ischium, and then medially and anteriorly is the pubis. The ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. Here they have rami, that 3 rami that produce this hole right here. That hole is a foramen, right there. There are narrow depressions or sulcus, and then fossa. There's narrow grooves or sulci and a fossa like this. Right here is a fossa. Sometimes these terms, these projections mean something that are specific to a bone. A trochanter is found there's 2 trochanters, there's a greater and lesser trochanter found just on the femur. The greater trochanter is superior, the lesser trochanter is inferior, and you can see those 2 right there. A crest and a spine are general things, right? A tubercle is another rounded projection. You see tubercles on the humerus, and you see tubercles elsewhere in the body. And then a tuberosity is another thing that's pretty common. The ischial tuberosity is right here, is part of the ischium. And the ischial tuberosity, which is projecting posteriorly and inferiorly, then is a point of attachment for muscles that are found posteriorly and inferiorly. So tuberosity is this roughened projection. Basically, if it's large and roughened, then it's a point of attachment for muscles. If it's smooth, then it's a point of articulation. You want smooth projections right here. So I'll give you an example of that. If you look right here, where my pointer is, that area right there is called the patellar surface. You don't want a rough area right there because you want the patella to glide smoothly as it goes superior and inferior. I don't spend a lot of time identifying the difference between the neck, the head, the anatomical neck, the surgical neck. I don't spend a lot of time in that. The neck is just basically the narrowed portion of the head. Facets and condyles are similar. Condyles are rounded and bigger. And a trochlea is another example of, and I think it's just found on the humerus. I'm not sure. I mean, when I say just found on the humerus, I mean for this class. Okay, I don't mean in the body completely. We talked about any of these things right here: the diaphysis, the medullary cavity, the epiphysis, the epiphyseal plate, and the epiphyseal line. So yes, we have, and that was what I just drew right here. The diaphysis is the main shaft of that, and the diaphysis is hollow, and that hollow area is the medullary cavity. That medullary cavity is pretty substantial as adults, and so the medullary cavity has a combination of bone marrow production or hematopoiesis. There's red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. We talked about that already. 2 epiphyses, there's a proximal and distal epiphysis. In both cases, those proximal and distal epiphyses are where the spongy bone meets the compact bone, and where they meet there at the epiphyseal plate. That growth plate is when you're actively growing. The line is when you're ossified, and therefore you're classified as an adult. You you may not be acting like adults, you may change your behavior, but when I say physically size of an adult, you're never gonna get any taller than this. So that's the definition of the bone. I mentioned the prefix peri, and so in the upper left-hand corner here, the peri or the periosteum, that peri is superficial, always, 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 and so it's a layer of tissue that's superficial to the bone. And there's two layers here. There's a superficial layer and a cellular layer. That fibrous layer is superficial. That fibrous layer is collagenous and particularly has lots of collagen within it. It also has blood vessels and nerves. So that superficial layer basically is structurally holding the bone together and supporting it. And then there's a deeper layer that's cellular in nature. If it's cellular in nature and the periosteum is, there's going to be 2 of the 3 bone cells that are found there. Which bone cell is not going to be found there? Well, there's osteoblasts and osteoclasts. They're not going to have osteocytes. Look at this term. I haven't used this term before. Osteochondral progenitor cells. What the hell does that mean? So what does osteo mean?
Bone.
What is chondral?
Cartilage.
So there's bone and cartilage cells. So what does that mean?
Is it generating those cells?
So they're generating those cells. So now what are we talking about?
You're talking about cells that generate bone.
So what process are we talking about if we're
Creation.
generating cells? What did we talk about in chapter 3 when we're generating cells?
Mitosis.
Mitosis and,
Cytokinesis.
okay? So osteochondral progenitor cells is another way of saying stem cells, which is another way of saying of hematopoiesis, which is another way of saying mitosis and cytokinesis. Okay? They're all the same thing. Now, what is different about this? Have you ever heard of the term stem cell?
Yeah.
The ultimate stem cell is a newly fertilized egg. A stem cell means that it can develop into many, many different things. There's, generally speaking, fetal stem cells and adult stem cells. Caden, Mrs. Gaspar's son, has a combination. He has some fetal cells, stem cells still. You guys don't have many fetal stem cells, if any. I don't have any. All my fetal stem cells are done. The only stem cells I got left are adult stem cells. Adult stem cells basically are sort of in this area where they just make a couple of different cells. Embryonic stem cells will make a huge array of cells. So if you think about every different type of tissue, all the different types of cartilage, connective tissue, nervous tissue, muscle tissue, embryonic stem cells will make those anything. This osteochondral progenitor cell is a form of stem cell, but it only makes 2 different types of cells, or generally 2 groups of cells. There's cartilage-making cells or bone-making cells. So this is a form of adult stem cell. And what they will start doing here is continuing on with as these cells make new periosteum, right here, the periosteum then, as you get away from the bone itself, if it connects to a muscle, right, it's one group of structure, and if it connects to a bone, it's another group of structure. Which things, tendons or ligaments, connect to bone to bone?
Ligaments.
So ligaments or tendons here? Ligaments that connect bone to bone. Tendons connect muscle to bone. So when we start unit 3, I'm going to do a drawing, and that drawing is going to draw that femur again, and I'm going to say we're going to start at the femur, and we're going to draw a tendon, and then we're going to draw a muscle, and then we're going to get to that skeletal muscle. So the ligaments and tendons are derived from the periosteum, and particularly from those osteoblasts, and those osteochondral progenitor cells, right? You need those cells because you're not making new bone, right? You're making cartilage and these tendons and ligaments. Those fibers are continuous with the bone, and so it makes it very, very strong. And I don't worry about those perforating fibers. The periosteum is dual layered and pretty complicated. The endosteum is pretty simple. It's narrow, a single layer of cells. Those single layer of cells will have a variety of different cells, right? There'll be osteoclasts and osteoblasts. There'll be osteochondral progenitor cells, those stem cells right here. One thing I want to, at the bottom of this this slide, I have a little bit of sort of questions or anatomical terminology. The endosteum will be superficial to spongy bone trabeculae. The endosteum will be superficial to the medullary cavity. The endosteum will be deep to compact bone of the diaphysis. Right? So all three of those things are true. The endosteum will be lining the medullary cavity and surrounding individual trabeculae of spongy bone. And there's that. If you look at this picture right here, in terms of, we are talking about the central portion of this picture is the diaphysis. There's the proximal and distal epiphyses right here. In the medullary cavity, which is superficially surrounded by the diaphysis is surrounded by the periosteum I just mentioned. The medullary cavity itself is surrounded by the endosteum. The medullary cavity has two types of marrow in it. Associated with the diaphysis is yellow marrow. Associated with the epiphyses, you see there's sort of this reddish hue here. The spongy bone tends to be associated with red marrow or bone cell production. I'm sorry, blood cell production. And then again, we get to here we have individual osteons. And now this is the last topic for today, and then we're going to stop. We have 6 different types of bones. You should be able to recognize and recall examples of these. You should be able to tell me which, if I ask you a bone type, so the femur, the parietal bone, the frontal bone, etc., what type of bone could it be? What type of bone could a vertebrae be? And so here are some examples of them. There's 5 examples here. And there's one that's not here. There's 2 in this picture right here. I don't know why they have 2 flat bones. But there's short, irregular, and sesamoid and flat right here, and we have a total of 6. The Wormian bone is the one that's weird. So a flat bone is this bone right here that looks like a sandwich with compact bone surrounding with the spongy bone sandwich. So that's a flat bone. There's no diaphyses, and we'll talk about how that ossifies or strengthens tomorrow. There's also short and irregular bones. Short and irregular bones really don't have very much of a diaphysis, if at all. So they have epiphyses, because those are ends, and those short bones tend to be associated with the carpals. Irregular bones are associated with the vertebrae. Long bones are in the lower left-hand corner, makes sense. Short bones, again, it was the carpals. A sesamoid bone. One example of the sesamoid bone is the patella, and then the Wormian bones are also called sutural bones. They're associated with, as you develop and you strengthen your skull, if the skull develops individual bones that are still ossified, then it looks like a Wormian bone. If someone else's skull doesn't have it and it's still ossified, it doesn't matter. All right. So tomorrow, what we're going to start doing is talking about so this is all the anatomy of bones. Tomorrow we're going to start talking about the physiology of bones. We're going to talk about 2 major topics. The first topic is ossification and how that goes about happening. And then we're going to talk about bone cell maintenance or physiology. So in particular, calcium. Okay? All right. So the vocabulary that I've used today is probably more substantial than I used in previous lectures, certainly the first unit. If any of this vocabulary is unfamiliar to you, the most beneficial thing that you can do is to write those terms down write them down 20 times so that you're familiar with them. And then any that you're not familiar with, ask me what the hell they mean tomorrow. If you don't do that, the likelihood that over the weekend you do it is very low, and the likelihood that you're going to remember for the quiz is even lower. I don't know. Speaking of that, before you guys leave, let me just show you one thing.
When do we know how? 14. Not next door in 2 weeks.
All right, so this is an announcement on the Bio 220 lab, the brain space. When is the quiz? Monday, October 7th.
Next week.
Okay, so that's not, what are we doing Thursday and Friday? Well, I'm going to Florida. I'm on a private jet, by the way. I got a private jet.